Hi, everyone. Welcome to Scholar Chats. We have the honor of chatting with Dr. Leslie D. Gonzales, who is an associate professor at Michigan State University. Dr. Gonzales's research focuses on legitimacy and legitimization within academia and higher education overall. In other words, Leslie is interested in understanding how faculty and other actors appraise some work and some scholars as valuable and fitting and others less so. Most recently, Dr. Gonzales' work has focused on legitimization via organizational practices related to faculty recruitment and hiring. She is committed to exposing and challenging both material and symbolic injustices within academia, particularly in careers of historically underrepresented scholars. Dr. Gonzales is actively using her work to engage departments, colleges, and universities in equity and justice-centered work, and has published in the Review of Higher Education, the Journal of Higher Education, Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, and Teachers College Record. A working-class Latina, first-generation college student turned academic, Dr. Gonzales is proud to have earned all three of her academic degrees at Hispanic-serving institutions. So let's chat with Dr. Gonzales. Well, hi, Dr. Gonzales. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Scholar Chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary, for having me. I'm excited to chat with all of you.
Absolutely. In your article that the class is reading this week, you stated your positionality, and we know there is passion and relatability to the topic. Can you tell us more on how this research topic came about?
Yeah, sure. So first, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate how you've asked the question. Let me go ahead and tell you a little bit why I start with that. So we often encourage one another, our students, to provide positionality statements in the context of their manuscripts, dissertations, whatever the project is. But sometimes I feel like positionality statements, while they are very important and very personal reflections on one's life, they may not necessarily help you understand how a researcher is connected to that piece of work. And this work is very much sort of an outgrowth, or it's very much, I guess, I have a very particular lens and an attachment to this project because of my personal history. So when I initially submitted the positionality statement, it was much longer. And of course, there's only so much space. And so I ended up having to trim it a good bit. But the story behind it is, and my attachment to this project is this. I think, like probably many students in the class, I was a first generation college student. I identify as a Latina, as a working class person. My family was very much working class. I grew up in a very rural part of New Mexico. And I didn't see or have a lot of folks around me growing up who had like professional educational credentials. But I did have a set of parents and a set of grandparents, two sets of grandparents, that were incredibly generous with their teaching to me. And I remember growing up in Texas before we moved to New Mexico, like every day my mom would work with me doing my ABCs. And like, I remember sitting very, very clearly sitting at our kitchen table. I had a little magnet board and we'd work on ABCs, and I would do a lot of reading and writing. And I remember my dad would always be teaching me like about math and engineering concepts. He has a very brilliant mind, and he never went to college, but he's brilliant. And so I remember learning a lot about like systems and math, and my dad was very political. And so since I was very tiny, I had a lot of learning in my home. It just wasn't formalized or credentialed in any sense. But I clearly remember when I was a kindergartner, this goes back to this young, my parents were walking me up to the school door. I clearly remember I was wearing a yellow dress, and I realized that something was happening between my parents and the teacher that was at the school door. There was two teachers, but my parents were interacting with one. I remember them, having me introduce myself, and I remember the teacher looking at my parents and like nodding and saying to the effect like, not to worry. We have English language special education classes. Like we can put her in special. And so there was like this immediate assumption that I wasn't going to be able to, do well in kindergarten. I mean, I was in kindergarten, for goodness sakes. And it was a very odd situation because I could tell my parents were trying to resist but didn't know quite how to resist. And it wasn't until much later that I learned what had happened and that my parents told me the story. I had this very early understanding, maybe third or fourth grade, when I first understood what had happened, that there are these systems in place um, that are used to evaluate and to judge whether a person is a knower or not. And when I was old enough to really process and understand what had happened, I knew something bad had happened. I knew it was a negative thing. I knew that the teacher didn't think like that I was ready or that I fit somehow, but I didn't quite understand all the details. But when I was old enough, again, still third or fourth grade, right? I immediately understood like that some of the work that my parents had put into me, essentially, and the learning that I had done with my family, that it was not really valid or seen like in the school. And I had a very early sort of suspicion, I think a healthy suspicion of evaluation systems and how we think about knowers and how that shows up now in my work in the context of academia, right? So I'm consistently thinking about and concerned about, how minoritized, particularly minoritized people sort of intersect with these systems and what it means for them to present their knowledge claims, their intellectual work, and to be taken as serious or to be immediately categorized as something other in that system. And so that is really, I think that story and that experience, there were many early experiences I had in the context of schooling. Where I grew up, it was a very, very white town. It was a farming town, and you were either the children of the farmers or the landowners, or you were the children of manual laborers or the farm workers. We had actually ended up living there. My parents ended up living there because my dad and his family have a history of seasonal migrant farm working. So my dad and mom married very young. He ended up living there. I was born there. But we were one of very few, Mexican, Hispanic identified, that's the language they use there, families in the town. So it was very interesting because I knew, now that I'm older, I understand that I was in the classroom probably with the children of the farm and landowners that my dad had worked. So, that story, I think, really anchors how I think about academia and how I think about how people get immediately recognized or thought about as knowers, producers of knowledge, so on and so forth.
For sure. Thank you very much for sharing that story with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. The theoretical framework you use for the study are critical feminism and critical race feminism. You laid out the differences between the two in your reasoning for choosing both in your article. Can you speak more about this?
Yeah. So it's interesting, although I had these very early experiences around where I had a very clear sense early on in my life about race and gender and power and how it worked in the context of this like really important institution, our schools. As I continued to go on through school and we moved to New Mexico and I went through undergrad and graduate school, I realize now that I was trained in a really mainstream or a very conventional fashion. My background is actually political science and sociology, and I came into higher ed sort of in a very crooked, unexpected pathway. But in political science, there's really not a lot of critical training. Probably the most critical training I got was Marxian theory, and then I got a little bit of feminist thought, a little bit. But the feminist thought, the feminist training that I got in my political science program was very much a sort of this white feminist perspective. And so there was very much a period of my life where I had these beliefs around I mean, what we would call now sort of these like universal notions of womanhood or sisterhood. And I sort of just thought like all women, no matter what, we could just bound together. Of course, now, older, wiser, more informed, more critically informed, I realize how race is just always in there, right? And class and colorism and language and all of these different statuses that we're all marked with. And so critical feminism was sort of my next step in my sort of trajectory development as a feminist. And I do identify as a critical race feminist. Critical feminism sort of raised the awareness in me that that there were differences among women, that we had to be conscientious of power and class, but there was still sort of that lacking like racial component. So when I found critical race feminism, I found a few things that I think that I've been looking for a while. Feminism, the way I first learned about it, was very essentializing. Critical feminism took a step, especially the work of like Elizabeth Anderson. Her work is incredible. Like she helped us to understand the differences, the power differences between white women and women of color overarchingly, right? Mm-hmm. But then when I look at critical race feminism, it takes it up even another level. Critical race feminism helps me understand how gendered and race dynamics are heavily attached to or like shaped by sort of a neoliberal market, like the marketplace, how economies of labor are organized around gender and race and how those intersect. So that's one thing. There's a very strong sort of capitalist frames in CRF, stronger than what I think I find in critical feminism. Most importantly, though, critical race feminism really allows me to push against any essentializing at all. And that's important because for a few things. So when we think about white women and women of color and sort of how critical feminism helps us think about that, this isn't completely true, but for the conversation, it's almost like there's these two like camps, these two like big categories. Critical race feminism says, no, it's not that easy. Like you've got to look first of all, it recognizes that whiteness is also racialized, right? So we see that in critical race feminism. So that comes in CRF. But then it also says to us that there are differences and gaps and power differentials even within groups that visually or biologically might seem the same. And so then we get to talk about, the intersections of class amongst, Latinas or, colorism, or we get to we are forced to recognize that women of color, white women in general, we can't be pressed or we can't be flattened to all be the same because we're all Black women, or all the indigenous women are the same in this way, or all of the Latina women are this way. And so CRF really forces us to combat essentialism and to really look for across group differences and within group differences. And I think that's incredibly powerful because there are so many ways, and I'm particularly concerned about women of color. I feel like there are so many ways women of color get sort of pigeonholed to do certain things, to be and to show up in certain ways. And we're much more nuanced than that. But we're often not allowed to be the way that maybe our, white women counterparts are. And so I'll just sort of say that there. I think that's why I moved towards CRF. And that's why I kind of try to play with both of them in the paper.
Yeah, I love it. Oh, that's deep, and I love it.
It's a lot. And I think about things all the time. I have a book that I was just reading last night. I think the person's first name is Andrea Hobson is her last name. And she writes about the three pillars of white supremacy, patriarchy amongst feminists. And like how even like when we're working, towards critical race feminist ends, we have to be really aware that there's always power within our groups, even within groups that some might assume are very similar.
Right.
So yeah, so that's why I sort of try to play with all of those different.
So most of the faculty in the study who identified as being of color tended to use subversive tactics in the article in their intellectual work. How would you agree or disagree with this approach, especially in the essence of decolonization?
This is a hard question because I think it's really important that when we think about faculty of color, which it often gets kind of conflated with diversity, I've seen lately that there's a lot of like immediate links to decolonization, and I think that those are really they are related but very distinct, and it's very important to think about decolonization even within our communities of color, right? So like if we are not native to this land, we're all settlers on this land. And so, and that is something that I have continually been trying to learn about and understand, like the privileges that I have, my proximity to whiteness, and what I can do, and when I'm in a position of power to try to be not only to decolonize, but to be anti-colonial in my actions, right? So I think that decolonization is like a separate conversation. So I'll put that there.
Okay.
And then I'll say about the faculty of color being subversive. I wasn't necessarily surprised to see that the women identifying, folks of color in this study were mostly subversive. I think that if we just think about even like, and I always lean on Saldua, but there's so many people I could lean on. Like there's this woman who I cite in the book who writes about, let me give you her name because she does such good work. I want to give her credit. Where is it? Oh my goodness, I can't see it. She's a woman, she's like a cultural food anthropologist, and she does work around looking at looking at culture and food and families. And in any case, we can think about Gloria Anzaldúa, we can think about this woman's work. I'm gonna remember her name. And we have so much evidence that women of color consistently approach their work with a fluidity that is not necessarily present in a lot of the mainstream canon work, right? So for example, we can think about Gloria Anzaldúa and how she writes or how she wrote about, the hybridity that women of color or women on the border, right? And often she described these women on the border as mestizas, right? She talks about their ability to work in hybridity, to bring a lot of divergent ideas together in one because they lived, they grew, they breathed in a really hybrid space. And I think that that's a common experience for lots of folks who live sort of quote unquote who live outside of like locations that are not dominant, right? So I think about trans folks, I think about queer folks, thinks about just lots of folks who are living in these marginal locations that they're always having to navigate. I think that shows up in the intellectual work. Has the academy been ready or willing to receive that work? Often no, right? So then that's where I can see where there can be maybe some connection to decolonizing work, but I don't think that all the work that faculty of color do is anti-colonial or decolonial, just because they're often bringing in these sort of subversive, often very interdisciplinary, very divergent ideas. I don't know that I would necessarily equate that to decolonial work. But I think that's a really good and important question. And one of the questions that we, at least in my mind, that is really important to me and that's been at the top of my mind for the last several months is how can I make sure that as a woman of color with still lots of privileges in the academy, that I can be anti-colonial and decolonial in all of my efforts? How can I catch myself when I'm, just reproducing the settler behavior? And it can be a murky path, right? And so, for example, you sit in certain positions of power, like on editorial boards or, as the ASH program chair. That's a lot of power. That power comes from colonial mechanisms.
Mhm.
Um, but in sitting in there, I'm thinking like, okay, what can I do? What can be the anti-colonial actions that I can take in this place? How can I build community with, Indigenous Native folks to make sure that in any case that I can, I'm being a really good co-conspirator. And not really good like I'm getting a cookie, but really good like that I'm being thoughtful and I'm being thorough in my commitment to decolonize the academy in the ways that I can.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer.
Yeah, of course.
Looking at your article right now, and I have lots of notes in here, but the parts that you mentioned, the Mestiza in the article, and how the identities are vast, right? Within, I mean, they're colonized people also. So thank you very much
Yeah.
for the thoughtful answer and how complex it all is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the study indicated that the majority of faculty who prefer to stay within the boundaries identified as white and were multi-generational. Can you elaborate more on why this is a reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think so. I'm thinking about the utility of, Bordeaux's concept of habitus, right? So I never wanted my work, and I hope that it never gets read as like, oh, here are white women doing their thing as usual. Um, I hope that it reads as a more nuanced approach, like when we have these privileges, these opportunities, these ways of knowing the academy and seeing it as operating its, how do you say, seeing its standard operating procedures as normal or as okay or as functional, then we are able to sort of be okay with it, right? And I think that that's what I saw lots of these white multi-generation college faculty members doing, right?
Mhm.
They were pretty familiar with the system. They had a comfortability with the system. They had I mean, I remember talking to some of these white women who very rarely express the kind of longing for representation or for sense of belonging that I often hear from faculty of color, particularly women of color. So, for example, there's one woman that I quote in there, and I can't remember if her discipline was humanities, literature, theater, sort of in that broad area. And she just had the most lovely academic career. Like it was just lovely. Like just course after course was just feeling like she was learning the material that she really understood and felt comfortable with. Um, and so when you have grown up in a system where things feel familiar, both from an academic curricular perspective, but then also from this like parental generational perspective, it becomes it becomes difficult. What is the expression? To see the water that you're fishing. How do you say it? The water you're swimming in?
Mhm.
It can become difficult or it can become challenging to recognize where things aren't fitting quite right. And you saw that there was this significant shift in one of the women's intellectual agendas when her children became very ill. Like it wasn't until she realized like, wow, the academy is built in this kind of a way that like I can't make all of this work, right? And there was a shift in the kinds of questions she was asking and the kinds of questions that she wanted to ask. There was another woman in the sciences who had done very conventional, very high theory work, just a brilliant woman, um, multi-generation college goer. She got to this point where she just felt like she wasn't connecting or making a difference with her students. And so she just said like something had to change. And it was interesting in her case, she really, I write about her more in another paper. She had to like kind of recognize like the work that I'm doing now is not the work that my colleagues are going to be super psyched about. Like nobody's super psyched about writing a textbook to ease undergraduate anxiety around math and math problems. Like that's not what
Wow.
institutions do, right?
I would think that'd be a very like exciting one, like a popular one.
Think, if a woman, if a person is doing that kind of work, they should try to be in I mean, not try to be, because we have very little control over like what our positions are, right? Like our academic positions, math education.
Mm.
In the context of pure math or mathematicians, that kind of work is not deemed as like real math.
Mm.
And so that was a really interesting sort of shift also.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful when we can get more to the holistic ways of looking at it, right? But like you said, the dominant norms, right? They,
Right, right. Disciplines are so important. And I don't I the disciplines are so different, but they have this common. There is something they all have in common, is that there are these disciplinarian sort of like guardians that are very, very interested in sort of guarding how that discipline is built and how porous or not those borders really are. And there are implications for folks that are doing work that is interdisciplinary, that challenges the canon. And oftentimes we see that those folks are historically minoritized folks in the academy.
how would you suggest universities, peer reviewers, and tenure committees should revise their evaluation policies to recognize the full scope of women's contributions to the academy?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I love this question. I had to like even take my glasses up because I have so many ideas. Um, so I have some really practical things, and then I have some things that I'm kind of thinking through right now in terms of current projects. And I think I'm going to start there, and then I'll talk about some like practical stuff that I think can help. I think that peer reviewers, faculty that are serving as reviewers for tenure promotion cases, hiring committees, there has to be some serious training, learning, and unlearning around how, this is going to sound funny, how to learn. What I mean by that is I have found that when I work with faculty around these issues, if you frame peer evaluation and peer review as an opportunity to learn about the discipline or about the topic in a different or new way. So if you position faculty as learners, there might be a little bit more openness there so you turn evaluation into a learning process. I am very curious, and I hope that somebody out there studying faculty careers starts to study like what are faculty members' appetites to learn and unlearn, to be learners. It's funny because our job is to learn and to grow and to push our disciplines and to think of new ideas and new language. And oftentimes I think that we're amongst the most resistant to that, right? Because it's about power, right? It's about control. And so I would really love for folks to look at like what are the interventions that help faculty to be able to shift their cultural schemas for understanding and thinking about their discipline. And I think that there's a lot of value in, this gets to the practical, there's a lot of value in doing training that, again, that helps faculty see evaluation as an opportunity to learn. There's also small things, right? So we know from philosophy, and I don't know that there's like a lot of like empirical work. I think there's some empirical work that's been happening around this. But we know that when there's evaluative context, that people rely really heavily on categories, right? Like people, naturally, this is like a survival strategy. We categorize the world so we can know where to place things, what's safe, unsafe, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there are some opportunities to do some training around how to be open to new categories when you are doing evaluation. And we know that evaluation, and that's what this is all about. We know that it's about sort of small things really matter, right? So if we can train and I'm thinking about really live interactional peer review. If we can really train faculty to think carefully and to be well prepared and to be thinking about inclusivity as they present cases or as they review cases, that could go a long way. For example, if you are, often at times when there's a peer review situation happening, there's going to be one person that's sort of tasked with taking the lead, right, with the peer review. If that lead person, maybe they don't understand what's happening, or maybe they've been challenged in the content, right? Maybe they're like, I don't believe this. I don't like this. I don't believe it. Like this person, like threatening the scholarship I've established for years. But they should never go into the evaluative situation with that language. So there can be language, there can be ways to frame. I think framing is really important. So an alternative framing to, rather than say like, I don't understand this, or like this scholar seems to be writing in the wrong discipline, another frame could be, when I read this person's work, I was made aware that there's so much going on in the discipline that I may not be aware of, and I need help for their understanding, right? Or like when I read this scholar's work, like I was really struck by these languages, these vocabularies. I haven't learned about them, so I'm trying to learn about them to really provide a solid review. That does a few things. It opens and allows for a conversation amongst the peer reviewers so they can talk through the ideas together. And then alternatively, it forces the peer reviewer to take on the role of learning, right? So this framing is really important. This learning and unlearning and having, I really want people to do research, like what are the interventions that are most effective on faculty, and what is faculty's appetite, right? Like what is their appetite? Like I finished school in 2010. Even though I'm in, like, the field of higher education has much more research that's happening now that I have to try to keep up with. And if I'm not, then I'm not going to be the best peer reviewer for the folks that are doing work. The same kind of things can be thought about for writing journal reviews, right? So for example, I just did an article review this morning, and it was a tough review to do. I didn't start out saying like, I'm going to reject this paper, but I started out saying like, this paper is strong in all these ways, and this paper also suffers in this many ways. Like, I didn't want to set the paper or the authors on negative ground immediately going into my evaluation. I think those small moves could have a big payoff. We need people to study those things. And some of my current work, that's some of what I'm trying to do, studying faculty hiring, studying evaluation practices in hiring, because we just don't know a lot about the collegial like evaluation process, the peer evaluation process. So I know it was a very long answer, but.
No, that's great. Thank you. The class viewing the Scholar Chat are doctoral students in higher education, many of whom are going into the professorate or will become administrators. What are your recommendations to them to blur the lines of boundary work, challenge epistemic authority, and promote epistemic justice going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I think that question in and of itself really suggests like a desire to challenge some of the dominant norms that I think are not healthy for any field, but particularly our field. And what I'm referring to is really this sort of division between theory and practice, or scholars and practitioners. Every practitioner, if that is how a person identifies, is always using theory. They just may not call it the certain things that it's called in an article. And it's incredibly important that practitioners are able to kind of unearth what those theories are, right? Because those are the assumptions, those are the worldviews, those are the parameters that they're setting for their work. On the other flip side, right? Scholars need to be thinking always like, okay, like how can this work be helpful in some ways? Helpful can mean a lot of things. Helpful can mean like, can I provide a new language? Can I provide a new concept? Can I raise a new question? Or can I really look at intervention and look at like utility, right? Or like effectiveness. So helpful can mean a lot of things. I think for folks who are, moving forward in the profession and scholar practitioners, practitioner scholars, um, I think holding on to any interdisciplinarity in their thinking, it can be tricky because oftentimes you feel like you have to do a little translation work for your field, right? So sometimes, even in higher ed, which is interdisciplinary, if you're not using a theory that is centrally located in higher ed journals or higher ed books, you still have to do a lot of mapping on. And I did a lot of mapping on in that paper, actually, where I kind of talk about, like, I'm bringing in this from these fields, and this is kind of like how it makes sense to what we know about faculty from the higher ed literature. But I think if scholar practitioners, folks that are doing writing and thinking, if they can hold on to any of the interdisciplinarity, any of the wisdom that they've gained through their practice, and then map it back on to some of the concepts or like the traditions that are more well known in the higher ed field, I think that that's really helpful. So again, I think holding on to that. This is probably not like, this is not like radical or critical at all, but at the beginning of any project, I often think about, like, okay, what are the ways that this project is going to be sound and a good contribution theoretically? What are my practical implications? Like, I think about all of these things, right? So in the beginning of a project, I always ask people, like, when they're going to participate, or if it's an institution that I'm having to ask to participate, would you like to talk at the end of the project? And can I come back and talk to you about the work and what I learned? And can I share with you, or can I even provide additional resources based on what I learned? And so I like to ask that as a question. Oftentimes people are not interested. And if you're working with administrators, they're often not interested. They're just tired and they're busy and they don't want to talk to you about what you found in your work. But I offer that because I want to be ready and willing to be able to make those practical connections. So I think that that's one thing. If you identify sort of more in the, if you forefront scholar in that identity, I think you need to always be ready and thinking about, like, how can you work with, give back to, inform the communities that have shared with you, given you access, et cetera, et cetera. So those are two of the things. I think holding on to the interdisciplinarity and always force yourself to be thinking, like, how could I engage in different spaces, and thinking about that from the very, very beginning.
Yeah. I want to emphasize what you stated in the article, epistemic justice. I really appreciate that. I think many folks do as well. So I just want to acknowledge that. That really stood out to me.
I'm so glad. We discussed that in the class this week, actually.
Oh, cool.
We read some of the original work from, we didn't read Miranda Fricker, but we read the article by Frank that I cite in there. It's interesting because most of the philosophers that have written about epistemic injustice, who I'm very grateful to because I use their work a lot, they often write about epistemic injustice rather than epistemic justice. And so I try to always kind of hold both in mind.
Yeah. So Dr. Gonzales, since you are also a scholar on the topic of legitimacy concerning the academy, I would also like to ask you a couple of questions regarding college ranking systems. How do dominant ranking systems legitimize or delegitimize certain types of work for faculty?
Yeah. So changing gears. So I appreciate this question because it gives me an opportunity to talk about how I think about ranking systems. So oftentimes when we read about ranking systems or we tweet something about them, like the first reference point that comes to mind is usually like US News World Report, right? Like that's like the vision everybody has. However, when I think about ranking systems, I actually think about it like, I call it a ranking regime, because I think if we think about ranking regime is bigger, right? It's like a higher order concept. And I think that within a ranking regime or ranking systems, that's what we want to use, there are so many different entities that are ranking, that are surveilling, ranking, watching, accounting for the work that we do. So in my vision of ranking systems, it's not just US News Report, like these commercial bodies. It's also like accreditation agencies. they're providing some form of ranking in some ways. It is, how do you say, like like very prestigious award systems or reward systems that are kind of out there providing rankings and accountings for how good or how high quality something is. And so how those legitimize or delegitimize academic work, I think that the research is pretty clear. I think that there's a high privilege and a high value that's placed on English language work. There's so much scholarship that's happening in the world, inside the academy, outside the academy, all over in all countries, and very little of that work is really recognized. Like there's not the infrastructure to recognize it in the same way. There's, I think, a lot of privilege placed on sort of these scientific or scientistic is what I usually say, sort of ways of production. So like and what I mean by that is, you know, scholars get recognized with fellowships or like these really big, I'm forgetting the word right now, but like these big recognitions, often on the basis of their knowledge production, right? And not just any type of knowledge production. It's like knowledge production in certain journals that are looking for certain ways of producing knowledge and showing knowledge and presenting it, certain formats, certain flows, you know, not necessarily for artistic kind of production, I guess is kind of what the comparison I'm trying to make. So I think that there are, you know, very narrow and very sort of Western, scientistic, very sort of adjacent to the market forms of knowledge that get, you know, amplified and rewarded. And what is often delegitimized, or sometimes, you know, delegitimization kind of suggests that something's in the running, right? But sometimes there's not even an infrastructure to recognize or to see other things that are happening. And so there's all of this work that is hidden away or that is not even considered. There's all sorts of scholars and knowledge producers, academics in community colleges and all sorts of different spaces that are not even being considered in those kinds of models and those sorts of formulas. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And as you were speaking right now, I kind of, you know, you said that there's different levels of ranking systems. I immediately thought about, you know, as a practitioner, I work in the financial aid world, so I thought about performance-based funding, and that's another form of ranking too, right? So thank you for that.
Yeah.
How does striving for prestige affect faculty life generally, and in particular, the experiences of faculty of color?
Yeah. I think that from my observations and then from my own direct observations and then thinking about the research literature more broadly, and it's been a while since I've looked at striving institutions, but I'll feel okay saying this. I think the faculty work is affected. I think faculty are affected in a few ways. I think workload often goes up. I think that we know from the research that has looked at this, and it's always a little messy, this research, but I think we can be confident in saying that when an institution is engaged in striving, if there's a reallocation of resources, those resources are not necessarily going to students or to student-related work, but often to the kind of infrastructure that is important to striving. So grant writing infrastructure. I remember when I did my dissertation work, the institution made huge investments in offices for like grant writing and the grant writing infrastructure, because it's a whole, I mean, here at Michigan State, I have access to an awesome office of people who are like helping me from point A to point Z. Like there are people who are in the pre-grant process, there's people that are reading my grant, there's people that are going to help me build my budget, that are going to help me afterwards. And so when an institution doesn't have that infrastructure, they redirect resources in those ways. But because faculty are like, okay, they're saying, we got to do more work, we got to publish more, the expectations are probably to bring in some more grants or start bringing in grants or to at least show that activity. But our students are our students. You don't change your student profile overnight. And so if a lot of these institutions are broad access institutions, it's really likely that you're going to have lots of first gen students, lots of students with families. You know, you're going to have your majority of the students who are a majority, you're going to have those students in your institutions. And because there's not a redirection to student supports of resources, faculty often kind of pull that work along with them, right? So it's not only they're doing more research or more, they're looking into grants now, but they're still maintaining their commitment to students. Or in the cases I've seen, the faculty who are like, all right, I'm on board, like we're going to do this, we're going to be a research institution, they let some of those student commitments go, not because they don't care about students, but because they were socialized in a system where they're like, yes, this is how we get there, right? And I'm going to bring on students, I'm going to teach them how to do research in this way. So their orientation and their relation to students is somewhat different. And I can't totally, like, it's not a totally bad thing, because in lots of, for example, in the institution I studied my dissertation, lots of those students were first generation Latino students. So to have faculty that were being hired that had a very strong orientation to research, and to have those students have access to those faculty, meant that they had access to a research network, and they had access to being on an NSF grant. So it is not like a black and white situation. However, the folks that do let go some of the heavier like advising or some of the heavier like care work that we might describe in relation to students, oftentimes those are going to be your women or faculty of color, your marginalized faculty that continue to do that, you know, very student-centered work. In some of the work that I've done, I've also seen that more advanced faculty, so faculty who have been at a striving institution for a longer period of time, they also carry a lot of that student-related work. But they also suffer in a way that I think is very important that we don't really name a lot. They feel a sense of loss in terms of the institution. I saw this in 2 case studies that I did. They felt like the institution that they kind of had an affinity for was no longer there. And so they felt like they no longer had a place there. And that was very difficult for folks who had given a very long period of time to an institution.
Yeah.
So those are some of the effects that I think are important. We don't study, this is another question that I hope somebody takes up. The sense of attachment that, I don't want to say older generations, but folks that are starting to retire now, they're retiring now, and I think that their view on the institution is it's really complicated. I think that these are the generation of faculty that really benefited from a huge support from government funding. Like they had some of them, right, had a very idyllic sort of career. And they're seeing academia change in ways. And I'm not talking about right now, like in terms of diversity. I'm talking right now, like in terms of like the meaning of the career. It's shifted in significant ways. And I think that you see this a little bit in the striving institutions.
Thank you. Dr. Gonzales, you offered lots of good questions for our students in case they need any topics for their dissertation. So thank you for
Yeah, that's
Is there anything else that you would like to share with the students watching this Scholar Chat regarding the article, or, you know, the ranking system, or just any advice in general?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity, Mary. So I'm going to say this. First of all, thanks for having me. It's always nice to connect with DU people. I always enjoy that. I'm going to say this. You all in the semester and every semester are reading brilliant work, right? Like you read these articles and you're like, wow, this sounds so smart. This is great. But I'm telling you, I want to put on the table that is not, the finished product took many, 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 many iterations and many rejections. And I think that that's important to put on the table, because sometimes we see finished products and we're just like, wow, like they're just so good at their work, or wow, how do they just write? And, you know, it's a community project, I'll tell you. That paper that you all read, the one about women's intellectual work, I think I had Kelly Ward, who actually passed. She was a chair, I think, or maybe a dean at University of Washington, I believe. She actually read that paper for me at ASH, and she gave me the best feedback, and I still have her note. And she passed, and so I kept that because it's very meaningful to me. And I didn't have a relationship with her, but I just think that was very meaningful. I had another woman who was at my session at ASH who came up to me and gave me like so many ideas and so many affirmations. I remember presenting this at ASH and feeling like it didn't go well. I presented it the year that Trump won, and so everybody was just sort of disheartened, and I was disheartened. But I had so many people that gave me affirmations after I presented it. And then I had about 2 or 3 other folks read it before I actually had it published. And getting it published was a lot of work. I got the first set of revisions back, and there was a lot of revisions, pages of feedback, and then another set of comments after that. So I just wanted to say that, like, we're all human. All of us academics are human. We're all fallible. This work doesn't come naturally to anyone. And so if there are days where you're feeling like, can you do this? Like, is this the work for you? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Be persistent in your work. And one of my most favorite interviewees ever, that I've ever interviewed in my whole life, I asked her, like, if she had any advice for future faculty, something to that effect. And she's like, the most important ingredient is to be tenacious. Like, it's just about being tenacious. She's like, because we all get rejected. We don't like to talk about the rejection. We often like kind of hide it away. We're very good now on Twitter and Facebook to highlight all of our successes, but it's always a community project, and it's always a lot of versions of that project before it ever hits the final stage. So
Thank you so much for that.
yeah, of course.
So valuable for the class.
Yeah, of course.
And thank you for joining us today, Dr. Gonzales. This was great, and really appreciated reading your article, and look forward to reading your future literature as well.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing your future papers, Mary.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll see you all. Take good care.